Wars tend to not end quietly. In what would become the final months of the Second World War, Japan had a choice: to accept surrender to the Allies, or to be destroyed as a nation. Though many histories of these months seem cut and dry, the reality was far less so. There was great uncertainty as to what path Japan would ultimately choose as the endgame to the largest conflict this planet has ever witnessed. Millions of lives hung in the balance. This is the retelling of those events. Prior to the atomic attacks, elements existed within the Japanese government that were trying to find a way to end the war. In June and July 1945, Japan attempted to enlist the help of the Soviet Union to serve as an intermediary in negotiations. No direct communication occurred with the United States about peace talks, but American leaders knew of these maneuvers because the United States for a long time had been intercepting and decoding many internal Japanese diplomatic communications. From these intercepts, the United States learned that some within the Japanese government advocated outright surrender. A few diplomats overseas cabled home to urge just that. From the replies these diplomats received from Tokyo, the United States learned that anything Japan might agree to would not be a surrender so much as a negotiated peace involving numerous conditions. These conditions probably would require, at a minimum, that the Japanese home islands remain unoccupied by foreign forces, and even allow Japan to retain some of its wartime conquests in East Asia. Many within the Japanese government were extremely reluctant to discuss any concessions, which would mean that a negotiated peace to them would only amount to little more than a truce where the Allies agreed to stop attacking Japan. After 12 years of Japanese military aggression against China and over 3.5 years of war with the United States, begun with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, American leaders were reluctant to accept anything less than a complete Japanese surrender. The one possible exception to this was the personal status of the emperor himself. Although the Allies had long been publicly demanding unconditional surrender, in private, there had been some discussion of exempting the emperor from war trials and allowing him to remain as ceremonial head of state. In the end, at Potsdam, the Allies went with both a carrot and a stick, trying to encourage those in Tokyo who advocated peace with assurances that Japan eventually would be allowed to form its own government, while combining these assurances with vague warnings of prompt and utter destruction if Japan did not surrender immediately. No explicit mention was made of the emperor possibly remaining as ceremonial head of state. Japan publicly rejected the Potsdam Declaration, and on July 25, 1945, President Harry S. Truman gave the order to commence atomic attacks on Japan as soon as possible. Following the bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, the Japanese government met to consider what to do next. The emperor had been urging since June that Japan find some way to end the war, but the Japanese Minister of War and the heads of both the Army and the Navy held to their position that Japan should wait and see if arbitration via the Soviet Union might still produce something less than a surrender. Military leaders also hoped that if they could hold out until the ground invasion of Japan began, they would be able to inflict so many casualties on the Allies that Japan still might win some sort of negotiated settlement. Next came the virtually simultaneous arrival of news of the Soviet declaration of war on Japan and the atomic bombing of Nagasaki on the following day. Another Imperial Council was held the night of August 9th, and this time the vote on surrender was a tie, 3-3. For the first time in a generation, the emperor stepped forward from his normally ceremonial-only role and personally broke the tie, ordering Japan to surrender. On August 10, 1945, Japan offered to surrender to the Allies, the only condition being that the emperor be allowed to remain the nominal head of state. Planning for the use of additional nuclear weapons continued even as these deliberations were ongoing. On August 10th, Leslie Groves reported to the War Department that the next bomb would be ready within a week. Truman, however, ordered an immediate halt to atomic attacks while surrender negotiations were ongoing. As the Secretary of Commerce Henry Wallace recorded in his diary, Truman remarked that he did not like the idea of killing all those kids. On August 12th, the United States announced that it would accept the Japanese surrender, making clear in its statement that the emperor could remain in a purely ceremonial capacity only. Debate raged within the Japanese government over whether to accept the American terms or fight on. Meanwhile, American leaders were growing impatient, and on August 13th, conventional air raids resumed on Japan. Thousands more Japanese civilians died while their leaders delayed. The Japanese people learned of the surrender negotiations for the first time when on August 14th, B-29 showered Tokyo with thousands of leaflets containing translated copies of the American reply of August 12th. Later that day, the emperor called another meeting of his cabinet and instructed them to accept the Allied terms immediately, explaining, "I cannot endure the thought of letting my people suffer any longer." If the war did not end, the whole nation would be reduced to ashes. The only question remaining now was if Japan's military leaders would allow the emperor to surrender. Loyalty to the emperor was an absolute in the Japanese military, but so was the refusal to surrender, and now that the two had come into conflict, open rebellion was a possible result. The emperor recorded a message in which he personally accepted the Allied surrender terms to be broadcast over Japanese radio the following day. This way, everyone in Japan would know that surrender was the emperor's personal will. Some within the Japanese military actually attempted to steal this recording before it could be broadcast, while others attempted a more general military coup in order to seize power and continue the war. Other elements of the Japanese military remained loyal to the emperor. The Minister of War, General Anami Korechika, personally supported continuing the war, but he also could not bring himself to openly rebel against his emperor. The strength of his dilemma was such that he opted for suicide as the only honorable way out. In the end, his refusal to assist the coup plotters was instrumental in their defeat by elements within the military that remained loyal to the emperor. There is still much debate on which factor weighed heavier on the decision to surrender. Was it the atomic bombings or the Soviet entry into the war? The short answer is that both weighed heavily on the leaders of Japan. The complete destruction of their nation in nuclear fire convinced some, potentially including the emperor himself, while the ease with which the Soviets penetrated into the Japanese empire convinced others, including some of the imperial military's top brass. Ultimately, the opinions vary widely depending on who it was, as well as factors such as proximity. For a Japanese officer fighting in Manchuria, the atomic bombs would likely not register as a factor. However, the Soviet juggernaut bearing down upon him would have seemed like a direct cause for defeat. In contrast, a civilian on the mainland or a soldier defending the home islands would have heard the news of the atomic bombs and would likely have associated their use with the decision to surrender. On August 15, 1945, the emperor's broadcast announcing Japan's surrender was heard via radio all over Japan. For most of his subjects, it was the first time that they had ever heard his voice. The emperor explained that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, and that the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb. Over the next few weeks, Japan and the United States worked out the details of the surrender, and on September 2, 1945, the formal surrender ceremony took place on the deck of the USS Missouri. The Second World War had finally ended, and the Cold War along with the atomic age had begun.